She won't last the winter." The words came before the price was even called. Quiet, but certain, and that was enough for the others to agree without saying much more, because once something is decided in that tone, it rarely changes. Another voice added that even the firewood would cost more than keeping her alive, and no one argued. Not because they believed it strongly, but because it sounded right enough to accept. The caller lowered the price once, then again, then to $1, and still no one stepped forward. Not because they couldn't, but because they had already decided she wasn't worth it. She stood where she had been placed, shoulders narrow, back slightly bent, not in weakness but in stillness, the kind that did not ask to be seen. And when the murmurs settled into silence, she did not look toward them, did not answer, did not shift her weight. And that held Caleb Turner's attention, longer than the words themselves, because most people tried to defend themselves before being dismissed. But she had already chosen not to. $1, the caller repeated, more out of habit than hope, and the yard quieted in the way it does when something has already been decided, and Caleb moved before thinking, the coin striking the table with a dull sound that carried farther than it should have, drawing a few looks that were more curious than impressed, and someone near the back muttered that he had just bought himself a burden. But Caleb did not answer, because he was watching her step forward, not relieved, not hesitant, just moving as if the outcome had never been in question. Up close, her face did not match the judgment. The lines were there. Yes, but her eyes were steady, clear in a way that did not belong to someone being sold for $1. And when he turned toward the road, she followed without asking where, without looking back at the crowd that had already dismissed her. And that stayed with him more than the price itself, because most people looked back at least once, even when there was nothing worth returning to. The walk to the ranch passed in quiet, wind cutting across the open ground, sharp enough to carry into bone, and Caleb glanced once at her step beside his, steady, even. No drag, no wasted motion. Like distance did not concern her as much as direction. "Name?" he asked after a while, more to break the silence than to learn anything, and she answered after a moment. "Eleanor." Nothing more, and by the time they reached the yard the cold had already begun to settle, and Caleb pointed toward the house and told her to stay inside until he decided what to do with her, expecting a question, but she gave none, only a quiet yes, and stepped in, without hesitation. And that unsettled him more than the laughter at the sale, because trouble usually made itself known early, and this did not. By morning, the kitchen held enough warmth to draw anyone close. Yet Eleanor stood where the heat thinned against the wall, not reaching for comfort, not claiming space. And when the men sat to eat, she moved only when needed, placing food without waste, setting portions without excess. And when her own plate was filled, she ate slowly, not watching the others, not speaking, and stopped before finishing, leaving a small portion untouched, not by accident, not from lack of hunger, but as if the meal had reached its limit before the plate had. Wade noticed first, asking if the food was not to her liking, but she did not answer immediately, only folded her hands once she had finished what she had taken, then said, "Enough is enough," and nothing more, and Wade gave a short laugh, calling it a strange way to leave a meal. But Caleb watched instead, because there had been no hesitation in the choice, no uncertainty, just a quiet decision that did not need explaining. After the others left, he remained longer than usual, watching how she cleared the table, not rushing, not slowing, leaving nothing wasted, yet not forcing what was not needed. And when she gathered what remained, she did not throw it aside, did not leave it for later without thought, but set it aside with care, as if even what was not used still held value. And Caleb found himself asking why she had stopped before finishing, not out of concern, but because the choice did not match the cold settling outside, and she answered simply, "You eat for now or you eat for later." and returned to her work without waiting for him to understand. By evening, what had felt enough in the morning had already thinned, the portions smaller without anyone noticing when it had begun. And Caleb saw it then, not in what she said, but in what she had already accounted for, before the day had even started. Outside, the wind pressed harder along the boards, carrying a sharper edge than before, and when he looked back inside, Eleanor had already moved on, not correcting anyone, not pointing out what they missed, just continuing in the same measured way, and that stayed with him longer than the meal itself, because it was not restraint forced by lack. It was restraint chosen before lack arrived, and as he stepped out into the cold again, one thought followed him quietly. She had not eaten less because there was little. She had eaten less because she did not trust what came next to give more. By midday the sun broke through just enough to loosen the frost along the trough, and Caleb expected anyone working outside to take advantage of it because fresh water meant less effort later. But Eleanor paused at the edge of the yard, looking not at the clear surface but at the older barrel set closer to the wall, the one that held yesterday's water, colder, slightly clouded, not preferred by anyone who had a choice. And when she crossed toward it instead of the trough, Caleb watched without interrupting, because the decision came too easily to be careless. She lifted the lid once, checked the level, then filled a smaller container without hesitation, not testing the cleaner source nearby, not even glancing toward it. And Wade called from the fence line that fresh water was running again, that she should take it while it lasted. But she answered without turning, "What lasts matters," and continued as if the matter were settled. Caleb stepped closer, asking why she would choose what was already sitting when something better stood within reach, and she set the container down before answering. Not defensive, not instructive, just certain. Better now is not better later. And left it there. Not long after, one of the younger hands dipped from the trough, drank quickly, then paused, spitting once as the surface shifted under movement from the animals pressing through it, the water turning cloudy where it had been clear moments before. And Wade muttered that it had gone foul faster than expected, and Caleb looked back at the covered barrel Eleanor had chosen, still untouched, still steady, and for the first time, the difference did not feel small. As the day moved on, he noticed the pattern repeating in smaller ways, the way she set things aside before they were needed, the way she left certain things unused without explanation, not out of neglect, but as if time itself were part of the decision, and when the wind shifted again, sharper now carrying colder air across the yard, Caleb found himself looking back at the trough, at what had been clean and had changed too quickly, and then at what she had chosen, unchanged, and for the first time. The choice did not feel strange. It felt deliberate. Later, when Wade returned and shook his head at the water that had not held, Eleanor said nothing, only continued her work as if the outcome had already been accounted for, and Caleb stood there longer than he should have, realizing that she had not chosen the worse option earlier. She had chosen the one that would not change, and that thought stayed with him as he turned back toward the house. That she was not choosing, based on what things were, but on what they would become. And he was only beginning to see how far ahead that kind of thinking could reach. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, pressing harder along the side of the house where the boards met unevenly, and Caleb moved through the room out of habit, closing what needed closing, securing what had always been secured. But when he reached the back door, he found it not fully shut, not open either, just left a narrow space where the latch should have held, and for a moment he assumed it had been missed until he saw Eleanor across the room. Not near the door, not correcting it, simply working as if it had been left that way on purpose. He crossed to close it, pushing it firm until the latch caught and the room settled into the stillness. He was used to, but only for a moment, because the fire near the wall shifted almost at once, the flame tightening along one side, leaning sharper than before, and a thin ribbon of smoke pressed lower across the room before lifting again, gone too quickly for anyone not watching. And Caleb stood there longer than he should have, not because of the fire itself, but because of how little it had taken to change it. He turned back toward her, asking why she had left it open, and she did not answer immediately, finishing what she was doing before speaking. "It was moving right," she said, and nothing more. And Caleb looked again at the door, at the space he had just sealed, then back at the fire, now burning in the steady way he had always trusted. Yet something about it felt different, tighter, less forgiving, though he could not name it. Wade came in from outside, brushing cold from his coat, saying the wind had turned again, that it would push harder through the night, and Caleb nodded without replying, his attention still caught between what he had fixed and what had changed because of it. After a while, he stepped back to the door and opened it slightly. Not wide, just enough to break the seal, and the air shifted again, subtle but present, the flame easing, the pull loosening, and for a moment, he stood there holding the space between open and closed, feeling the difference without fully understanding it. Eleanor did not look up, did not confirm or deny what he had done, and that stayed with him more than any explanation would have, because she had not argued, had not tried to stop him. She had simply left the decision where he could see its result for himself. As evening settled, the door remained not fully shut, not fully open, and Caleb found himself glancing toward it more than once, not out of concern, but because the smallest change in position seemed to shape more than it should have. And as the fire continued its steady burn, he realized that what he had always treated as simple, close it, secure it, keep the cold out, was not as simple as he believed, and the fact that she had known that, without saying it, unsettled him more than if she had explained it outright, because it meant she was not working against the house or the weather. She was working with it, and he was only beginning to understand how much difference that made. Night came colder than the day had promised, and the fire was fed early, wood set heavier than usual, the flame rising steady in the way Caleb trusted, the way it had always held through long winters, and the men settled close without thinking. Boots off, shoulders easing, the heat drawing them in the same way it always did. But Eleanor did not move toward it. She stood a moment at the edge of the room, watching not the flame itself but the space around it, the way the air carried it, the way the warmth pressed and thinned in uneven lines. And then she chose her place. Not the warmest, not the closest, but a step away where the heat did not pull as hard. Caleb noticed because he was looking now, measuring her decisions against his own, and he almost told her she would feel the cold there. Almost said it out of habit, but stopped, because the choice did not look uncertain. It looked decided. Wade shifted closer to the fire, feeding another piece of wood, and the flame caught fast, rising sharper along one side before settling again, and a thin line of smoke pushed lower than expected before lifting. Not enough to trouble anyone, but enough that Caleb marked it this time, and Eleanor had already seen it just for a second, then lay down without adjusting anything, without correcting what she clearly understood. The room quieted as the night deepened, the fire settling into a steady burn that hid the uneven pull beneath it, and one by one the others drifted into sleep, trusting the warmth to hold as it always had. But Caleb stayed awake longer, not watching the flame, but listening to the way the house carried it, the small shifts, the faint pull through spaces he had never needed to consider before. He glanced once toward Eleanor, already still, already placed where the air remained clearer. Not the easiest place, not the warmest, but the one that did not take more than it gave, and the thought returned sharper than before. She was not avoiding the fire, she was avoiding something within it, something he had not yet seen. The wind pressed once against the outer wall, low and steady, and the flame answered it with a slight lean, just enough to show how easily it could change if the pull grew stronger. And Caleb felt a quiet unease settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the sense that something was not as stable as it appeared. He closed his eyes only after marking where she lay in relation to the room. Not out of concern, but because something in him had already accepted that if the night turned, she would be the first to know it, and, just before sleep, finally took him. One last thought stayed longer than the rest. Not that she had chosen a colder place, but that she had chosen it before anything had gone wrong. And that meant she had not been reacting at all. She had been preparing, and Caleb could not yet decide whether that should have reassured him or warned him. Caleb woke before the heat changed, and that was what unsettled him first. Because the fire had not failed, the room had not cooled, yet something in the air felt thinner, sharper, carrying a weight that did not belong. And when he opened his eyes, the room looked unchanged for a moment too long, before the smell reached him. Faint at first, then clearer. Smoke gathering above where no one looked until it was already too late. Wade stirred near the fire, shifting a log without understanding what had begun, and the flame caught hard along one side, rising faster than it should. Not spreading wide, but climbing in a narrow line that followed the same pull Caleb had noticed earlier. And that was when movement broke. Not into shouting, but into the wrong kind of urgency. Men reacting to what they could see, instead of what was coming next. Caleb pushed himself up, turning toward the door by instinct, toward air, toward escape. But before he crossed the room, Eleanor was already moving, not rushing, not calling out, just stepping into the space where the pull had been strongest. And for a moment he hesitated, because it made no sense to move closer to danger. Yet something in the way she moved, steady, certain, made him follow. The flame surged higher for a breath, catching along the beam where it should not have reached, racing upward in a narrow line that would have carried across the ceiling if left another moment. And Caleb felt it then. Not heat, but loss already forming. And that was when Eleanor moved through it. Not faster, but sooner, shifting a single piece of wood at the base, opening space where the fire had been climbing, then crossing to the door and pulling it wider. Not closed, wider, and the air broke at once, the tight pull collapsing, the flame dropping, not out, but down, forced to flatten instead of rise. And Caleb felt the difference before he understood it. "Here," she said. Not loud, just clear, guiding him not toward the door first, but toward the space where the air would hold long enough to move. And Caleb followed without question, pulling Wade with him as the smoke thickened behind, and only then did he see it. The fire had not been spreading in every direction. It had been following a path, the same imbalance she had allowed all day. A beam cracked above, sharp enough to freeze anyone still inside. But it did not fall where he expected, did not collapse the way it should have, because the heat had shifted, redirected just enough to spare the space they stood in. And for a moment, everything held. Barely, but enough. They moved out into the cold. Then air hitting hard, clean, and Caleb turned back once, expecting the house to be lost. But the flames stayed contained to one side, burning where the draft had once fed them strongest, no longer spreading the same way. And that was when it settled. Not in words, not in explanation, but in something he could not ignore. That she had not reacted to the fire. She had moved through it as if it had already happened, and as the smoke thinned into the night and the damage stopped where it should have continued. Caleb understood. One thing clearly for the first time. She had not been ignoring the danger. She had been waiting for the moment it could no longer be denied. By evening, the house stood quieter than before. Not because the damage had settled, but because the way Caleb saw it had changed. The air still moved, the gaps still pulled, the fire still needed tending. Yet none of it felt simple anymore, because now he knew it followed lines he had never learned to see. The men worked without much talk, rebuilding what had been lost. And when Wade reached to tighten the wood stack out of habit, Caleb stopped him with a quiet, "Leave it," not sharp, not forceful, just certain. And Wade stepped back without question, because the night had settled more than words ever could. Someone lingered near the doorway longer than needed, watching the room in the same quiet way the crowd had watched the sale, not speaking, just seeing, and Caleb noticed it without turning, because he had stood in that same place before, judging without understanding. Eleanor moved through the room, without drawing attention, as she had from the beginning, but she no longer stood at the edge, no longer held herself apart from the space, instead taking a place where the air held steady. Not the warmest, not the easiest, but the one that balanced what the room required. And Caleb saw it clearly now. Not caution, not distance, but understanding. He stepped toward the fire, watching the flame lean, the smoke rise, the pull shift through the same narrow paths. And for the first time, he did not reach to correct it, did not move to set it the way he always had. Instead, he stepped back slightly and said, "Where should it sit?" Not because he lacked the answer, but because he no longer trusted the one he had always used, and Eleanor looked once, not at the flame, but at the space around it. Then moved a single piece of wood, nothing more, and Caleb followed that placement without hesitation, without checking it against his own judgment. And that was the moment everything settled, not in the fire, but in him. Because this time he did not return to change it, did not measure it again. He let it hold as she had set it. Outside, the cold deepened, but inside, the fire burned steady. No sudden rise, no uneven pull. And Caleb did not wake to listen for it, did not rise to check what might fail, because for the first time, he understood it would hold. Not because of the fire itself, but because of who had placed it. Wade crossed the room once more, slower this time, watching the flame instead of the stack, then stepped back on his own, and that was enough. Eleanor did not move away, did not return to the distance she had kept before, but remained where the fire held true, and nothing more needed to be said. Because the change had already settled, in the only place that mattered. Not in the house, not in the fire, but in who decided and who followed, and from that night forward, Caleb did not set the fire again. If someone stayed quiet the whole time, would you think they knew nothing, or that they were waiting for the moment it mattered? If this story made you pause, like it, share it, and subscribe. Echoes of a Rancher for more stories where nothing is rushed, and everything reveals itself at the right moment.